While we were enjoying the compelling Ken Burns series, The Roosevelts, last week, oh, so good. The race for governor trotted on. Governor Martinez has been airing a commercial critical of Gary King's handling of that infamous case involving the Casanova con man and Mr. King's vote to raise taxes while in the legislature 20 years ago. Meanwhile, Gary King lost another campaign manager and has struggled to raise campaign funds. And Dan, this week the two candidates appeared at a forum here in Albuquerque for NIOP, the big group, that real estate group here. It wasn't quite a debate, it was a discussion. It was answers given ahead of time. People had time to prepare for it. I don't think we learned much from that debate, but where are we now in the overall, in your view, in this race? Besides the obvious, King's down on money and down, 18 points down. But October is critical. A lot of things can happen in October.
I think that the governor's race is a foregone conclusion.
Really?
No,
wait. You've been around politics a long time.
Oh, I know a lot can happen.
Yeah.
But Gary King doesn't seem like to have the ability to make anything happen.
Okay.
So unless it's self-inflicted, I think the question really is how much strength Governor Martinez has down ballot to help change the legislature. I think that's where the race is. The race is not between Gary King and because there's really the other races out there. I think Secretary of State's going to heat up to be a pretty good race. Not sure about Attorney General. I would think Hector's got a pretty good lead there, but I think the battle royale is going to be, does Susana Martinez and her team have the money, which I think they do? Do they have the ability and the desire to reach down ballot and start pulling legislators with them and have that cataclysmic, monumental change in the state of New Mexico, where you're going to re-elect a Republican, change the House to Republicans, and really put a closely divided Senate in the mix? I think that's where the story is. I think Governor King. Governor King. Oh gosh, sorry about that, Jay. Don't get mad at me. I think at the end of the day, I think Gary King's ability is just zero. He's got none. And I think that it's just really going to come down to, can Susana Martinez really get a mandate, and that is change the House?
Can she? That's an interesting question. We'll get to the legislation in a little bit, but can she? Is a win that overwhelmingly possible that'll affect that down ballot that much?
I just want to sort of a little bit of clarification here. You started with he's 18 points down the ballot. I assume you're quoting the Journal poll, the Brian Sanderoff poll. I have to remind people that there are other pollsters besides Brian Sanderoff. I know the Journal, that's the go-to, and certain stations, that's the go-to.
That's true.
But there was a CBS poll that had different numbers. There was a Rasmussen poll in July of 2014 here, just a month ago, 2 months ago. 43% dead heat is what they had, and it was 860 likely voters conducted July 21st through 22nd. Plus or minus 4 percentage points error potential there. And so, I think it depends what kind of polls you're looking at. I don't think that Brian Sanderoff is the be-all, end-all. He doesn't have a magic 8-ball. He's not, a fortune teller. He is one pollster, and it's important for people to consider the methods and how they're being, the samples, all of that is important.
The other guys have
so
really
there's
bad
a range there. There's a range there.
Well, that CBS New York Times poll you mentioned was like a 5-point difference.
It was like a 5-point difference. So there's a range of potentials there. And I do think that one of the important things to keep in mind is that first of all, the rolls have not closed yet. So people can still register to vote all the way until October 7th. And I think if you listen to what Dan said about this potential for the governor to reach down into other races, I can't think of a better reason for people to get out there and vote and make sure that doesn't happen. I think there's a lot of people who will still go to the polls and be energized in this election. And one of the things that's important to look at, yes, he's down on the polls, according to a couple of those polls, but also, and he doesn't have as much money, but when you actually talk to the people who are supporting him, a lot of them are really fired up on the issues that they care about. So environmental issues, for example, I just went to an event where many supporters were there and saw a very clear, difference between Gary King and Susana Martinez on a lot of the environmental issues that a lot of people care about. And I think that's gonna serve as some late money that's gonna come into the race that's gonna help him quite a bit.
Tom, it's interesting on Dan's point, we've seen this a lot in politics. If somebody calls something a foregone conclusion, one of two things happens. People either buy into that, or like Laura says, they say, I don't think so. And they get fired up by it. And a lot can happen in October. Again, I'm not saying right or wrong, Dan's right or wrong here, but a lot of things can happen. Don't the Democrats have a lot more in their quiver they could be using here at some point?
I'm sure the Democrats do. Gary King does not. And I think that was very evident when you watched the NAIOP debate is that there was absolutely no strategy or appearance of strategy, no appearance of game plan going in, especially when his first comment—
By Mr. King.
The Attorney General King, when his first comment is defending negative advertising by his opponent. Right. That's just like,
Talk
just
about
don't
drawing
do
the
that.
parameters of the debate.
Yeah, he just framed it right there.
Right.
But so the Democrats do have a lot to potentially lose, and I believe that they're just they're hopeful that Gary King can come up with some type of October surprise. It's not going to happen, and so it's going to be as a result of races like the Secretary of State race. I agree 100%. I think that all of a sudden there's blood in the water there, and there has been for a while, I believe.
It's an important race.
And
People
it is a
don't
very
realize how
important
that race
race.
I think
is.
we're seeing now, actually,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
of the Supreme Court decision.
Exactly right.
So yeah.
Please. Yeah, it's interesting. And Sophie, the idea that at that debate, Gary King really didn't take, as Tom's mentioning, have any quips or any sound bites after that debate? Has anyone heard? No one's heard a thing. There was nothing that was offered
But
out
I don't
there.
think that that's really, to that end, I'm not sure that that's part of Gary King's public image or brand, or I'm not sure that quips would be authentic for him.
Well, the one that he got off that it said, "I have dust on my shoes and she doesn't," in his opening statement, it just didn't quite get
Yeah, I think he's a
there,
little
you know?
he's a little
Not sure what that
challenged.
means.
He's a little challenged in that arena.
No, no, no.
I want
He's
to
out
say
campaigning.
this. I will confess, I probably did this at this table at some point. I counted Gary King out in the primaries.
Okay.
I didn't think he was going to make it. And we saw this groundswell, I mean, almost to Dan's misstatement earlier, we saw this groundswell of people in some ways, and this isn't really to defend the King campaign, but in some ways, his expenditures could include all the money his father ever spent on his races, getting people familiar with the King name. And we saw some of that in the primary. I'm looking to see whether that happens in this real race. And then the other thing I'm sort of picking up on something I said before about down ballot. We have yet to see a governor's race in which there's no straight party ticket and the top player, the governor, is able to bring everybody else with them. And so it will be interesting to see if that shifts for us, but we're really in new territory in New Mexico with that issue.
Interesting, or Dan mentioned this, what is it, 3 votes to make a swing in the House to Republicans? It's not a big gap.
It's not a big
You know,
gap, and
you-
so
you couldn't-
there's a handful, 5 or
Yeah.
6 seats that are really tight or really up for grabs, and I think those are the ones where you'll see the most action from both sides, and you're already seeing quite a lot of effort.
Right. Finish up, Dan, if you would.
I think it's completely out of any realm of expectation that Gary King can make a comeback in this thing. I think he used the King name to get through the primary. We forget that primary voters are a lot more in tuned voters. They're people that are more adamant about their positions.
A little bit older as
that's
well,
right.
and-
And
yeah.
so I think that he called in all the chits he could in the primary. I don't think it's going to happen now. I do think the battle is really, I would tell you, I think that New Mexicans should be looking not at Gary King, but at the future of New Mexico. And the future being, you got Susana Martinez, who's a fairly young governor, Republican, running for a second term. You've got a fairly young, aggressive Democrat in Hector Balderas running on the ballot. You have a guy out there that's kind of getting missed in this whole deal who's making unbelievable moves, I believe, in New Mexico and growing power, and that's in Kenny Martinez, the Speaker of the House. I mean, this is a man that has amassed an unbelievable amount of power and is working hard to make sure the House stays in control of Democrats and wins more Democrat seats. This is a guy that's campaigning all over the state of New Mexico, working. I mean, he just did a fundraiser the other day for Hector Balderas. I mean, so I think that this race has more to do with where New Mexico is going in 4 to 8 years than what's going to happen in the governor's race coming up.
Let's see what happens in October. This could get interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of races in this world where suddenly 15, 18 points just disappeared overnight for some, like you said, a gaffe. You never know. You never know. Now, coming up, it's been presented as a solution to a variety of economic problems, and that's public banking. We'll hear about the efforts to set one up here in New Mexico next.